your work as a poet or affected your understanding of what poetry can do?
So I wasn't planning to publish my poetry, ever. Because poetry for me was a thing I did for pleasure, was a hobby, was a naughty little thing I did on the side. I'm an academic. I went into politics as a contestant for the run towards national elections, yeah? I wanted to be a member of parliament. And then I confronted what ordinary poor Ugandans confront. The fact that when the public does not, the government does not work for the public, poor people suffer. My father died, he was a medical doctor looking for medicine. He had the knowledge that he needed, and like most other Ugandans who rely on medical doctors to diagnose and prescribe, my father knew what was wrong with him. He knew what medicine he wanted. And he needed one single vial of medicine to ensure he didn't die. But he went from hospital to hospital to hospital looking for this single vial of medicine. If he didn't keep medical ethics and he stocked his own medicines, he'd be alive today. My mother died a year later looking for an ambulance, waiting for an ambulance that never came. We live 5 minutes away from the national referral hospital in our district, but she died waiting like a poor woman for an ambulance that didn't work, although she had children living in the city who had cars. All of us could have sent 4 cars to her if we'd known, but because there are no ambulances in my country, my mother died. Now, during my moment of grief, I began to write very angry poems against the state. And these are poems of a child saying, my parents' grave is unnecessary. The poems I write, these ones that say, don't come in my mouth, a very bitter, angry book hitting ba, 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 against the regime, are the poems that took me to prison. And indeed, the dictatorship thinks by arresting us, by charging us, by pathologizing us and saying we are mad, that is why we use poems against the dictatorship. I was slapped with a travel ban by reducing or minimizing our mobility within the country and outside, by freezing my bank accounts. The regime thought that all that persecution would stop me from writing poetry, right? And we think that for me, the biggest form of resistance is to say, even in prison, even when you say I'm mentally sick because I write about you, Dictator Yoweri Museveni, I will continue to write poetry. And so my resistance poetry is resistance poetry. It's saying I will not shut up. You will not put words in my mouth. You will not stop my pain. I've said if you break my pen and you break my fingers, I will write from my other orifices. I'll insert a pen like a woman's product into my vagina and write with it with my blood. I was handcuffed and naked in solitary confinement, and I used my handcuff to scratch into the walls of that prison cell, not as a mad woman, but as a woman resisting. And I scratched the words of Bob Marley. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery into the walls of solitary confinement with my handcuffs. When I finished, they were bloody, but I had made a point. When the wardresses came into that room, I was still naked. They had wet the floor. I was still on a wet floor. With their own handcuffs, I had scratched into the wall a message. That is resistance, right? And I think in exile, part of my fear is I'm losing the fight. Germany is sweet. The public transport works. The health system works. I'm so far away from what's happening in Uganda. And so when I begin to write about exile, it's both an embrace of the new freedom I have, but a resistance against the forgetting of the pain of my people. So the dictatorship, by allowing or forcing me to go to exile, still is trying to control my ability to resist. But the published works, I mean, this book is important because it says even in Germany, and I don't speak German, the Germans are hearing about what's happening in Uganda. And it's not very beautiful poetry, but it's important poetry. I read some of it in the first section. And when I'm not writing to German people and publishing books, because it's very difficult to get published in German, I send my works to journals that get translated. Maybe they translate one poem, maybe they translate 2. But this was published last month in Austria, and it has some of my naughty poems. I'm still resisting.